Betwixt and Between, Patterns of Masculine and Feminine Initiation, edited by Louise Mahdi, Stephen Foster, and Meredith Little. Menstruation and Shamanism, Marilyn Nagy. Menstruation and Shamanism by Marilyn Nagy, it's N-A-G-Y, deals with meaningful aspects of feelings and emotions accompanying menstruation. Is there an unconscious psychic factoring process accompanying the physiological structure of menstruation? There is some evidence for speaking of a psychic cycle of the woman as contained within the menstrual cycle, at least as a model. In this study, we discover unique components of women's initiation through the menstrual cycle. The author analyzes the development of feminine eros using women's dreams and myths and their relation to women's inner and outer relationships. Dr. Nagy presents a provocative hypothesis about taboos relating to the menstrual cycle in traditional cultures from a contemporary perspective. Marilyn Nagy, PhD, is a Jungian analyst practicing at Palo Alto, California. A graduate of the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, she is presently a faculty member of the Pacifica Graduate School of Psychology. She is also a professional member of the Swiss Society for Analytical Psychology, the graduates of the C.G. Jung Institute, and the San Francisco Jung Institute, of which she is a former secretary and chairperson of the reviewing committee. She has published in Psychological Perspectives, Quadrant, and the San Francisco Jung Institute Library Journal, and Voices. I became interested in studying menstruation many years ago when I was suffering from horrendous depressions which went on and on every month before my period came. The depressions must have begun sometime late in my teenage years. I don't remember exactly when, but I do remember a time in the 1950s when I was in graduate school in Boston, going to the doctor for a yearly checkup and telling him about my symptoms. He gave me a prescription to take for my premenstrual depression. The whole idea of a premenstrual syndrome was very new at the time. I was relieved to think that my depressions had a physiological cause. Just what that cause was, no one knew, but it seemed reasonable to think that medical researchers were on the way to finding out what kinds of hormonal changes might be causing this premenstrual distress. Well, as a matter of fact, this hasn't happened. We know now that endocrinologically, menstruation is a relatively quiescent interval, with the lowest body levels of estrogen and progesterone of any time of the month. At the same time, in the last 25 years, we have gained much more clinical awareness of the emotional concomitants that surround menstruation. In Japan, there has been much work done on periodic menstrual psychosis. In the United States, we know quite a lot more about the depression, sleeplessness, and emotional lability of the syndrome than we did before. But this is nothing new. Women know that they are not themselves at their periods. A woman may be cold or, on the contrary, unusually warm. She may every month suffer days of depression, or she may find herself unexplainably cheerful, only to have this mood swept away by a softy, teary sentiment. Women are so accustomed to all this that they accuse themselves by saying, "Oh, it's just my period." They direct their psychological behavior to a physiological cause. But just what the physiological cause of our menstrual emotional symptomatology is eludes us completely. But now let me go back to my own story. The next phase of the development of the idea, on the conscious level at least, came in Zurich 6 or 7 years later. I was 2 or 3 years into my own analysis, and by this time, I was well initiated into Jung's point of view that not only the aberrations of my behavior, but also the apparently accidental meetings with people who became important to me, the seemingly spontaneous chains of events in my life, and of course, my physical illnesses, all had a meaning, that is, a psychological reason for happening. Now, this is an important key to what I want to say, because I want to try to take you with me on the same journey that I have been on. A journey in search of a reason, namely the meaning of menstruation and especially of the emotional events which accompany it. About this same time, or a year or so later, while I was still mulling around these things in a very confused way, I started my analytical work. I happened to have 2 or 3 women analyzans who were rather passive and didn't find very much to say during their sessions. They also did not bring any dreams. But at intervals, without anything very different happening in their outer lives, so far as I could tell, they suddenly seemed to be dreaming more frequently, or perhaps their dreams were much stronger in effect. These women then became very active and brought in emotionally laden material, so we could really work. It occurred to me to ask them casually if they happened to be on their periods. The answer was so often yes that my interest in the matter became acute. If an intensification of the emotional life is actually typical of the onset of menstruation, then why? What does this mean? This observation suddenly reversed my thinking. What if the depression, or as with my analyzans, emotional alertness, were not caused by menstruation per se, but by a psychological factor at work in the whole menstruation syndrome? It is after all only in modern Western culture that medical knowledge about conception and menstruation has tended to depotentiate our valuation of the menstrual period. In pre-literate and traditional societies, it is everywhere given the greatest attention as an important and extremely dangerous time. Our current collective view, that normal bodily processes should not be emotionally disturbing ones, does not prevent some women from highly singular behavior at monthly intervals. I had seen that in myself, and I was seeing it again in my analyzans. Of course, not all women complain of special moods at the menses, and some who are often disturbed have occasional periods go by unnoticed on the conscious level. But I have the impression that sometimes women do not notice because society expects them not to notice. One woman who recorded her dreams together with her menstruation dates for me wrote, "I don't know whether it was so before I started writing down these dreams, but now it seems that everything goes along and piles up till the end of the month, and then explodes." I decided to see what I could find out about menstruation, but not by dealing with consciously experienced moods and feelings at the menses. I wanted to look at unconscious material to see if there might be an unconscious psychic factoring process, an archetype, at work within the physiological structure of menstruation. This meant I had to go to the mythology and folklore of primitive societies, since modern societies have suppressed such material as taboo. And I also had to study women's dreams, menstrual taboos, and the demon husband. In the beginning of my research, I found a mass of confusing material. The mother of a menstruating girl in Malabar pours a jar of water over her head. A Javanese girl is powdered yellow. A Malaysian girl has her front teeth filed away. Out of the ancient world, Pliny reports that contact with menstrual blood turns new wine sour. Crops touched by it become barren. Seeds in gardens are dried up. The fruit or trees fall off. The bright surface of mirrors in which it merely reflected is dim. The edge of steel and the gleam of ivory are dulled. Hives of bees die. Even bronze and iron are at once seized by rust. A horrible smell fills the air. To taste it drives dogs mad and infects their bites with an incurable poison. What can we conclude out of all of that? Apparently, menstruating women everywhere, except in our modern Western societies, are in a very holy or taboo condition. And this taboo condition has something in it which is a strong force opposed to our everyday life. I found out that menstruating women are very frequently separated out of their social groups. They live in a menstrual hut outside the village and are sometimes secluded for as long as 2 or 3 years at the pubertal onset of menstruation. I wondered why that was, until I read that the Maori male lives in a deadly fear of menstrual blood because he believes the evil spirit Kahu Kahu inhabits it. Then I began to find in one text after another that at the time of menstruation, the woman is possessed by an animal or a godlike spirit. Among the old Iranians is the demoness Jahi, the goddess of prostitution. It is through her works that menstruation was created, and each month during her period, the woman is in the power of this evil spirit. The Siamese thought it was the evil spirit swimming in the air who entered in and caused the wound, the monthly menstruation of their women. In Cambodia, unmarried girls were called the wives of Indra. Ancient Assyrian texts refer not only to the Lilith, the ghoulish feminine spirit who could possess a man, but also to the Ila Lili, who possessed a woman when they became Nida, or menstruous. Louis Ginsburg wrote about a Jewish tradition which says that menstruation is the penalty for Eve's sin, and since sexual desire is considered as the result of the eating of the forbidden fruit, the Gnostics, as well as the Kabbalists, maintain that menstruation came to Eve with the enjoyment of the fruit. The fruit in question came from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Apparently there is a connection between A. menstruation, B. temporary marriage to the Idlulili, C. sexual desire, and D. knowledge of good and evil. The more I thought about this, the more excited I became. because it seemed that here might be a clue demonstrating that all these strange customs have a meaning in common, but I could not really understand it yet. What seemed to be the key was the idea among all these societies that menstruation was connected with being possessed or married to a demon or god. There is a folk legend stemming from a mountainous district in Japan which reflects the emotional stress and danger of the menstrual period, both for a woman and for her social group. The story is called Ottawa Pond. Once upon a time, a beautiful but humbly clad lady came to the temple of Chofu Kiju, which stands beside this pond, and asked for lodging. The priest pitied her and received her, and she gave her name, Ottawa. In the rice planting season, Ottawa went gathering bracken, and without noticing what she was doing, got too near to Mr. Kanhoku, which hates the presence of women. On the way home at dusk, she washed her blood-stained underwear in the pond, and suddenly the pond grew larger, and a voice came out of the haze, saying, "I am Kami of this pond. I have been waiting for you to come for a long time. You must become Kami of the pond in my place. This is the fate that has been determined since the foreworld." Ottawa begged for pardon, but received only 3 days' grace. She went home in a trance, and when the priest asked her the reason, she told him, weeping bitterly. The priest preached the way of Buddha to her until she conceived faith as though reborn, and on the 3rd day at dawn a voice called outside her door. She said farewell to the villagers and rode toward the mountain. There was a sound of hooves, a strange wind, and a bitter rain. Then a noble man on a white horse appeared, picked Ottawa up on the saddle, and disappeared into the morning mist. He was the Kami of the pond. Still today, the village people give offerings to the pond, commemorating the day when Ottawa wed the former Kami. In this story, we can see clearly the connection between the affective state of the heroine and the image of the demon husband. That is to say, we do not see why they have to be connected, but only that they are both part of the situation, like a priori factors belonging to menstruation. The strong, attracting power of Ottawa's menstrual blood-stained clothes delivers her into the power of the demon of the pond and forces her to marry him. The weak emotional state of the heroine is also entirely typical of other legends of menstruating women. She is so forgetful of the protective taboos as to go near the forbidden mountain, then to wash her clothes in the pond. She returns home in a trance, gives herself over to weeping, and on the appointed day accepts her rendezvous with death in the pond. She is completely in the power of her demon husband. The fateful violation of the taboo often results in a religious conversion, but not in remission of the penalty. Ottawa is reborn but not in life, so that her religious experience is not psychologically integrated. If the menstruating woman in traditional societies is really in such a state of possession, then it is understandable that she is taboo. Both she and her social group have to be safeguarded. By this time, I felt fairly certain that the common image which keeps appearing in the folkloristic traditions is that of the demon lover or spirit husband. But the prevalence of this image is not confined to ancient and primitive sources. In the 20th century, Freudian theory about what a woman experiences at the menses is strikingly similar. Basically, it is this: a woman experiences her menstruation, a fully normal phenomenon, as an unnormal wounding of her inner parts. Hidden behind the bleeding is a secret belief that it is the bleeding from a wound, namely the wound of her castration. The fantasy says, "I have neither child nor penis." Failure to menstruate may represent an attempt to heal the wound and to have an undamaged sexual organ like men have. In this mythologem, there is the sense of being inwardly wounded, just as the Siamese believe that evil spirits entered into the wounds of their girls and wounded them. The suggestion is that women want to be man and feel the loss of their masculinity in the form of a penis most keenly each month at menstruation. Let me anticipate my own conclusions. What I suggest is essentially the same thing. A woman is wounded each month by the painful encounter with her inner lover or with her spirit husband. The pain arises out of the experience of the two sides of her own nature. "I have neither child nor penis" means I have both a masculine and a feminine spirit in me. Freud's contention that a woman's ego remains incomplete because she is caught in permanently unfulfilled longings for her father ought perhaps not to be rejected out of hand, though I might wish to translate the terms in which his clinical observation is expressed. The sense of loss, of wounding, of desire — loss and desire are paired opposites — corresponds in a surprising way to the affective character of the images of the lover, which appear as menstrual motif in traditional societies and in the dreams of modern women. Women may be not so much incomplete as marked by eros as the connecting principle to the opposite sex, with relatedness as the central factor of the feminine ego. The demon lover and the strange man in menstrual dreams. While I was doing my research on this subject, I collected women's menstrual dreams. Would there be a correlation between whatever I found through historical research and the content of modern Western women's dreams? Originally, I had no idea that I would find this image of the menstrual lover. I thought there might be something about the mother. I did a small pilot experiment obtaining 500 dreams which occurred just before and just after the onset of the menses, when emotional tension appears to be at a high point. Since that time, 2 doctoral dissertations have much expanded the design and repeated the experiment. However, the matter still seems unsettled since the results of one experiment done with adolescent girls differ from the results I obtained, while a second experiment agrees with my conclusions. In my own sample, I was struck by the statistical frequency of the recurrence of an image which I finally called the strange man. Many of these dream images sound remarkably like the images of the otherworldly lover of so much menstrual mythology. The strange man is an intruder in the established order. We would not be very surprised if a woman dreams of her mother, or even of her father, or of marriage. They all belong to family life and to a traditional feminine role in society. But the image of the unknown man who appears on the scene, often in a highly threatening and dangerous pose, disrupts the harmony and suggests an opposition to this present state of things. The opposition, personified in the image of the stranger, appears to be a new factor in the psychological situation. The attributes of the image, together with the affective qualities attached to it, may indicate the direction along with a change in consciousness is taking place. There is a sampling of fragments of dreams from the experiment, or of course they cannot be interpreted in any way since the dreamers are completely unknown. What I hope one can hear through them is how the emotions of love, sexual arousal, fear, aversion, and fascination are inextricably bound together with the image. Here we are beginning to make a connection between an inner image and a sense of outer behavior so typical of menstruation, the dreams. Our choir director was also there, and I was somehow close to him. There was a beautiful, erotic feeling which made me feel very happy. B. I got left alone at a subway station and couldn't get out. Men started coming around me saying rude things and laughing. I had feared this and tried to reason with them. C. I travel in a train at night. An asthmatic-looking man climbs through the window into my compartment. He speaks to me, kisses me, throws a flaming red blanket over us in order to protect us from the glances of other people. He says I should go with him. Almost without any willpower, I follow him. He goes across a meadow where we have to be careful of dangerous hornets in the grass, and then come to a lake where we want to go swimming. D. A terrible, angry man bursts into the house where my sister and I are alone and rapes both my sister, who is married, and me, a virgin. E. It is late in the evening. I have just finished taking a shower and putting on a pale pink nightgown. I open the bathroom door, which opens into my bedroom. The bathroom light is on, but the bedroom is in darkness. I barely discern the sleeping figures of my husband and 3 children in the bed. They all seem to be sleeping face down. Now I become aware of a figure standing in the darkness in the hallway doorway. I can see only his leg. Somehow I know that he is not going to do anything. He only wants me to know that he is there. There we stand in 2 doorways, side by side, like a medieval diptychs, and visually we are opposites. He in darkness, male, dressed in rough dark clothes, and I, female, in the light of the bathroom, all pink, light, soft, and moist. How can it possibly make sense to lump together such desperate images under one heading? Can the images of a subway rapist, a choir director, a lover, and an unknown stranger in one's home be described in common terms? Shouldn't we guard against the unknown man and welcome only men we know to be safe for us? The answer to these questions devolves from our characteristic response to events in life. Surely we can suppress new experiences for a certain amount of time, but no one can master his life so as to prevent all change and still live. Whether a new event is greeted with hope or cursed as a dark fate may depend not entirely on whether it is good or bad, but also partly on the inner attitude of the person to whom it happens. Love is like that too. Every lover comes first as an unknown stranger, and promises a woman both great joy and great danger. Perhaps these menstrual dream images of the strange man have a psychological purpose pertaining to just those inner attitudes. Conception and sexual desire at menstruation. In the face of widespread prohibition separating a woman from her husband at the time of her menstruation was the almost equally widespread belief that conception takes place most easily or exclusively just before, just after, or even during the monthly bleeding. The ancient Chinese said the last day of menstruation was the best time to conceive. Susruta, the great Indian physician, agreed that at this time pregnancy most rarely occurs because then the mouth of the womb is open, like the flower of the water lily to the sunshine. Aristotle, Pliny, and Galen all thought that women conceive at the menses. The Talmud, although strictly forbidding the man from approaching his wife until 7 days after the conclusion of her bleeding, nevertheless admits the possibility of conception during the prohibited time. But the children born of union during the menses will be scrofulous, feeble-minded, crippled, epileptic, or insane. And later on, in the Christian church, Thomas Aquinas held that not only was intercourse during menstruation a deadly sin, but that children born of it would be leprous or monstrous. As late as the beginning of the 20th century, the great German gynecologist Hermann Ploss and the American gynecologist Havelock Ellis thought that all the evidence pointed toward menstruation as the time of conception. Margaret Mead, in an early study of cultural patterns in a North American Indian tribe, describes the falling into disuse of the old prohibitions during menstruation. An old Indian woman says, "When we were young, we kept away from our husbands for 4 days. Now this is no longer done. And look at the young women today. They have a child so high and so high and so high, and one hiding in their skirts, and one on their backs, and one in their bellies." Conception, therefore, clearly occurred during those 4 forbidden days. The observation that sexual desire among women is very heightened, often before or even during menstruation, has been made since ancient times. That was partly the reason why physicians thought conception must take place then. But since the discovery of the fertility cycle in 1937 by Naus and Ogino, this factor has been disregarded, since it clearly did not fit the procreative purpose of nature. Yet Havelock Ellis, in 2 essays, The Phenomena of Sexual Periodicity and The Menstrual Curve of Sexual Impulse, amassed a great body of evidence to show the tendency of the female to sexual intercourse during menstruation. He used 2 cases, in one of which the incidence of masturbation and the second of which the erotic content of dreams were correlated in the menstrual cycle. In both cases, he found a positive harmonious curve which supported his conviction that the times of conception is coupled with the period of desire in women and with the menses. It represented a remnant of her former animal nature, in which oestrus was the normal time for receiving the male. The taboos against intercourse at menstruation were only a cultural overlay with which an enlightened knowledge could well do away. Today we know otherwise. Children are not conceived at menstruation, yet the long-held belief that conception takes place at menstruation is a psychic fact, if not a physiological one, and points to the psychic presence of one who can give the woman a child. The stringent warnings from medieval pulpits against intercourse during menstruation would not have been necessary were they not some powerfully attracting force toward doing it. Neither would the death penalties in Semitic societies, nor the death-producing shock of even seeing a menstruating woman among some primitives. Either the woman is somehow especially desirable at this time, or she is especially desirous, which is to say the same thing. Menstruation and Shamanism. We are still on our journey in search of the meaning. If women, in fact, do not conceive at the menses, although for thousands of years it has been believed they do, this belief is a fact which must have a reason. If women are often sexually aroused at menstruation, then we are observing an instinctive reaction which does not serve procreative purpose. But then, what purpose? I began to find some of my own answers when I came across descriptions of shamanistic initiation practices for women, both in rituals which have been culturally preserved and in North American Indian legends. In Mircea Eliade's book, Shamanism, he describes how girls became shamanesses among the Aboriginal tribes of India. First, the girl has a dream in which a suitor from the underworld appears and asks for her hand in marriage. The girl at first refuses, with the result that she is plagued by nightmares. The divine lover threatens her with attack or with fall from a high place. The girl may then fall ill or be dissociated for a time. She wanders about alone in the woods or fields. Finally, she accepts the call to be a shaman. The family arranges her marriage, and afterwards, her tutelary husband visits regularly, takes her into the jungle for days at a time. She bears him a child, but the relationship is not primarily sexual. She is instructed by him through her dreams and thus fulfills her tribal duties. Almost exactly the same thing is described in the myth of the Kwakiutl Indian of the northwest coast, called the Ke Almadalanaga. The tribe was at its winter quarters. Their chief was named Quad, and he was giving a winter dance. Then his sister Kiwalanaka disappeared. She had not long disappeared when she became really sick, at the place where the women stay when they disappear. But after 2 nights she was heard talking with the spirit, who is called Helaman, asking him to give her a sacred song. Then she disappeared again, but at night they heard her song from far away. Then when night came, they all went into the dance house and began to beat quick time on their boards. And then Kwawalanaga uttered the cannibal cry at the door of the dance house. And as soon as she came in, she turned into a shaman. She sang her sacred song, and she bit 4 men. She said, "I have been brought back to life by our friend Helena, and he said to me that if anyone who should make love to me inside of 10 years, he would immediately kill him. Thus said our great friend to me, and for 10 years I shall cure the sick ones among you." The place where the women stay when they disappear is the menstrual hut located outside the tribal area. The sister of the chief goes away for her usual separation period, but then she receives a call to become a shamaness and really disappears, meets her tutelary spirit, Helaman, spends a period of time with him in the woods, and then re-enters the tribe to take up her shamanic duties. How similar and yet how different in this story from the tragic Japanese legend Ottawa, who met her death with the kami of the pond. Here the meeting with the spirit at menstruation leads to a vocation as teacher and healer. Another tale of the Kathalamet Indians is called the Gila Unalex Maiden, who was carried away by the Thunderbird. It tells the story of a tribe which used to go hunting elk high in the mountains, but there was a narrow trail through which they had to pass, which was possessed by the Thunderbird spirit. There was a young girl who was menstruating for the first time, and she was not allowed to go, but she did not like to stay alone by the tents. And one day a woman said to her, "We are going to dig roots. I went up there although I was menstruating, and nothing happened to me. Perhaps they deceived you only." So on the next occasion, the young girl went with the women. But then, when they were on the mountain, the other woman lost her. They searched for her but could not find her. A mist covered everything. Then they went to the high trail possessed by the Thunderbird, and there they found her, near the rocks. They called her, took her hand and tried to pull her. She did not move and did not speak. Her face was changed. So the women finally left her and went back to the tribe and told her people that she had become a monster, and they were all weak with fright. The next day the tribe's people went to search for her but could not find her. The tale concludes. When it becomes foggy, she is heard singing shaman songs in the rocks. Thus she did. When they came to the place where she was, she sang shaman's songs. Then the people gave up the search and went home. The chief went home. Therefore, it is forbidden to take girls who are just mature up Saddle Mountain, because that girl was taken away. The Thunderbird took her. It seemed to me that with the discovery of these legends, my search for a psychological rather than a physiological explanation of those peculiar emotional states accompanying menstruation had finally found an answer which could satisfy my desire for a meaning. That meaning focused on the image of the strange lover or the spirit husband, which appears in the myths, legends, and dreams of menstruation. The union of the woman with this lover cannot have to do with the bearing of children in the outer world. Yet the character of the imagery bears all the marks of a truly instinctive and therefore purposive phenomenon. The Indian shamanic legends show that it may have an inner spiritual purpose. In that case, the problematic affective condition of the woman at her period may indicate an inner preoccupation. That is what it really means to be possessed. In neither of these myths does the fact of becoming a shamaness have a very happy result for the personal development of the young woman. In the Kathalamet myth, the girl falls into a psychotic state. I suspect that the ego consciousness of the relatively primitive groups out of which these stories come was not differentiated enough to permit a real confrontation with so powerful an archetype, nor an integration of its contents. Therefore, the women who fell into possession of the spirit are really lost to all further life in the tribe. Perhaps that is why the menstruating woman was regarded as so terribly dangerous, because her state of possession at this time threatened the collective ego of the tribe. Only in modern Western culture has consciousness become strong enough to give even the possibility of assimilating the appearance of the spirit lover at the menstrual period. Reflections on Shamanism and Feminine Psychology. What do we mean by an ego consciousness that is differentiated enough or strong enough to permit assimilation of an inner figure? And how do we pass from a stage of culture, personal or collective, where assimilation is not possible to one where it is? It should be remembered that menstruation appears only in the highest of species, from the primates upwards. In most lower animals, the moment of ovulation is simultaneous with heat or estrus and with coitus. The female is therefore absolutely identified with her instinctive nature. Among humans, mating is not limited to the period of heat. There is a distinct difference between ovulation and the moment of physiological conception and menstruation, which ends the post-estrum and begins the new cycle. The human female is not bound to accept her lover only when she can conceive a child, as with other female animals. She can take him at any time she wishes, and this fact represents all the beginnings of psychic differentiation. It marks a moment where choice, or personal eros, intervenes in the biological scheme. Instinctive desire is split off from a necessarily procreative goal. The primary unconscious identity between subject and object is broken when the object can't be perceived and valued. Where a woman can choose, the existence of an other herself becomes subjectively real for her. This provides a polarity in which differences, and thus psychological consciousness, are possible. Thus the energy which is released toward the onset of menstruation, and which the unconscious presents in image form as the strange lover or god husband, may have as its purpose and psychic development of a woman. It is not the physical child which is conceived at menstruation, as was so long thought, but the spiritual child. Yet it is the same instinctive eros which leads to the conception of a child at ovulation. We have then some evidence for speaking of the psychic cycle of the woman as contained within the menstrual cycle, at least as a model. Half of it, the time leading up to ovulation, belongs to her collective and instinctive life as a mother and procreatrix. The second half, leading up to menstruation, belongs to her psychic life as an individual, with a personal destiny to understand and fulfill. Of course, seen from the outside, things are just reversed. In the days after her period, the woman is often released from her confusing emotions. She is open and energetic and capable of much creative work, and in the days approaching her period, she is quite obviously in a regressive state. She is apt to suffer alienation from others. Conflicts which can usually be contained assume monstrous shapes. Daily duties may be suddenly altogether impossible, and we have seen in legends how really dangerous this regression can be. But the introverting libido of the second half of the cycle seeds the extroverting libido of the following period. I think that is why the figure of the shamaness appears in the legends of women at menses. She represents the inherent possibility of the woman not only to bear a child, but also to understand, to teach, and to heal. It is the mysterious interweaving of both phases which gives meaning to the whole. At a still deeper level, the possibility of personal eros, which is contained in the separation of ovulation from menstruation in women, also opens out. In the fact of desire made conscious, the whole realm of the shadow, of conflict, and the problem of love. We are back now to the Kabbalist legends about menstruation as Eve's penalty for enjoying the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Desire wants to possess what it desires, yet never succeeds. The reality of the shadow is born, together with eros, when the image of the lover is constellated, within or without. The creative tension of these dual aspects of instinct, libido, makes it possible for the true individual to emerge. Eros creates an energetic continuum along whose path all creative activity takes place, but is maintained only because of the dark fact that Eros never stops wanting and is never fully fulfilled. The tension of Eros obviates true altruism, yet without that tension, life is also flat and unreal and unconscious. If the love problem, the union of the opposites, is insoluble in outer life, so it is also insoluble in inner life. This does not mean that there is no way to go. It means that the way to go is back and forth, from inner to outer and then again inwards. The meeting of the woman with her lover at an inner level where conscious understanding of her life is developed, where personal creativity finds its expression. where spiritual values can be affirmed, that is, where the whole difficult process begins to make sense and be worth doing, is a mere preparation for the shattering demands of love in a real human relationship. We never come anywhere near coping in a responsible way with the need for intimacy and tactful distance in friendship, with the me and the you in our roles as parents. We fail in our capacity to carry both the suffering and the companionship of marriage relationships. We are in love and out of love, filled and empty, hungering and devouring, affected so deeply that we are engulfed, or so little that nothing happens. We defend our personal integrity against the invasion of love. We use power techniques to avoid exposure, and power to catch and limit the freedom of the loved one. Yet the demand for union is so compelling that we are forced to improve on our failures. It is a false dichotomy to speak of the resolution of the problem of love on either the outer or the inner level. It must be worked on, though it cannot be finally resolved at either level, otherwise life has no meaning. This is the model that we see in the menstrual cycle, where we find evidence of a biphasal patterning in feminine psychic life, a phase in which energy progresses into outer life, and a phase where adaptation breaks down, where affectivity predominates, and the image of the lover is presented in unconscious material. Does this mean that we succeed in the progressive, less emotional phase of our lives, only to fail in our emotional times? No, I think not. This is just the danger of the rationalistic temper of much current thinking. It is precisely the psychology of the woman to succeed where she is failing. Her capacity to submit to being in love both on the outside and the inside, to be involved with another than herself, masks her capacity for change, for experiencing what she did not experience before, and thus for both true consciousness and for conscious loving. The capacity to accept emotion is the condition of conscious psychological and intellectual development, not its antithesis. Jung's concept of the animus as an inner male component of the female personality, which is the carrier of her potential for psychological development, is repugnant for many women nowadays, who consider that men and women are in fact much more similar than culture until now has allowed them to be, and that a strong ego and capacity for achievement in the world are certainly not male prerequisites. It may well be that Jung's descriptions of the animus are relatively undifferentiated and depended largely on the type of transference projections he was apt to constellate in his women patients. Yet anyone who has worked extensively with women's dreams material and listened carefully to what makes their lives move cannot avoid realizing that women's dreams about men and relationships with men have an enormous effect, whatever their stage of maturational development. Why should we be surprised by that? Biologically, it is simply a fact that the sexual libido reaches a level where it is useful for the preservation of the species when it is focused on heterosexual relationships. This fact has symbolic and psychological as well as biological significance. Whatever the life of a woman is all about, it must not be different in kind from her biological determinants. It must also be fruitful for the life of the species. The symbolic imagery which expresses the extension of the biological into psychological function will surely not lose track of body imagery and instinctive libido. How inhuman if it did. The unconscious appears to ignore the fact that women today are experimenting with great freedom of all sorts of love arrangements and goes on producing endless dreams of the male lover. Perhaps such dreams are even exasperated because of our tendency to resist a compensatory unconscious viewpoint, or because collective attitudes in the Western world have become rationalistic, ignoring the presence in psychic life of a contrasexual other, which cannot successfully be integrated into equal consciousness. What I pay attention to, more than the arguable content of what the image of a lover is the quality of what is happening in the relationship between the woman and her opposite, the one who is the not I in her life. The mystery of love is that the loved one can be received but not want, or else love fails. Desire may be fulfilled in a moment outside of time, but is never finally satisfied, so long as life lasts. The loved one remains different and unattainable. What does happen is that increasingly, the need for a personal and productive relatedness to people, to general goals, to the world of ideas, is embraced and acquired as the goal of life. Insofar as what I have just been saying has to do with the relationship of the feminine ego to the unconscious, and thus with psychological development, the appearance of the figure of the strange lover in the menstrual cycle of women may indicate that the patterning of the individuation process in women is different than with men. Menstruation belongs to the first half of woman's life, not the second. Perhaps she is not so able to split her development chronologically into two halves, with collective duties in the first years and personal development later. Women's collective duties with children and family are in any case highly personal, and her personal development is apt to have results for the collective. Perhaps her whole psychological development depends from the beginning on the dialectic between inner and outer relationships. Individual differences among women must be respected. They surely cover a wide range. But if it is true, as I believe, that the psychology of women is reflected in biological rhythms, or vice versa, and since it is clearly the case that women's biological functions fall into the same time span as the first appearances of the strange inner lover who beckons the woman to personal psychological development, then affective relatedness must all along be the key to feminine psychology.